Looking for a fun, different new shirt? Something related to the things you like? Climbing in the outdoors, perhaps philosophy? Visit our new store, theDIHEDRAL Goods on Etsy, and you'll find all that and much more.
I'm on! Roll! Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the theDIHEDRAL podcast. This is Carrot, and today we're going to be talking about the father of philosophy, Thales of Miletus. So I thought it'd be fun to talk about him. He's a really interesting, eccentric person, which is sometimes typical of philosophers. So, a lot of people, when I kind of suggest or ask who is the father of philosophy, you'll hear people say Aristotle or Plato or Socrates, but actually Thales predates all of these guys by a pretty good margin. And so, yeah, let's talk about him. Now, getting into what was going on at the time, we're going back to the ancient world. Thales dates are from like 634 to 548 BCE. And so prior to Thales, we're kind of coming out of what's called the Archaic period, which runs from around 800 to 500 BCE. And what's important to note about the Archaic period as we approach the classical age, the age of the Socrates and Plato's and Aristotle's of the world, is that what we refer to as mythology, it wasn't mythology to them. That was life. And so when they would make sacrifices to Gaia for a good harvest or Zeus to be successful in battle and things like that, these weren't just stories. These are gods that they believed in. And so one thing about belief in these ancient gods is there wasn't a lot of room for philosophical questions. And furthermore, oftentimes people would think it would be offensive to ask questions when the answer to most questions were just considered, oh, it's because the gods will it that way. And so when we get to Thales, somebody who starts asking these really unique questions, it's not only because he was smart, but he certainly saw the world in a completely different and original way. And so some of the things that started happening as we move from the Archaic period, that period that you've seen pieces written by or composed by Homer and Hesiod, like the Iliad and Odyssey and the Theogony. Of course, there are advances in that period that give people more time. And as we get more time, we try to fill it. And one of the ways people started filling time back then was by simply thinking and asking questions. There wasn't a lot of activities to sort of bide your time. And so you just sit around and start talking and thinking. And so two things that came out of that talking and thinking is that people started asking what are referred to as second order questions. And so most of us are good at asking questions. And if we get an answer we don't like, we'll oftentimes question the answer. Back then, they started to think, look, if we're not asking the right questions, then we're never going to get the right answers. And so while it is important to question the answers, it's equally as important to question the questions that you're asking. And so this is one of the things that led to Thales breaking new ground in the world of philosophy. So second order questions, and then people started putting an intrinsic value on knowledge. So in the Archaic period, we needed to know, for example, what we should sacrifice in order to get a healthy crop from Gaia or something like that. And that would be extrinsic. We need to know this because we want to get something out of it. In this kind of new approach to living, people just wanted to learn stuff because it's fun to learn. And I imagine that's why a lot of people will listen to a podcast, because there's intrinsic value in the knowledge that we gain. Now, of course, you could use some of these things from all the podcasts that are out there extrinsically, but there's some intrinsic reason as well. Okay, so that being said, I think we're set up to start talking about Thales and what made him a little different. So Thales, he was this natural philosopher who was asking, again, these quasi-scientific questions. And while Thales' answer to these questions are really interesting, the fact that he was able to ask these questions is what really sets him apart from the pack, because this would be a scary thing to do. And it's really far thinking, like way outside the box. So the question that Thales asked is, what is everything made of? And this isn't maybe that interesting of a question to us because we've been talking about it for a very long time. But what I really want to stress is is the importance of asking a new question. Imagine asking a question that nobody you ever talked to or nobody you ever had contact with ever thought of in the entire history of the world. Imagine asking a question or coming up with a question that just hasn't been thought about. That takes a really, really, really high level of curiosity, and creativity. And that was Thales. And so there was some danger in asking a question like this. When you ask a question like, what is everything made of? The answer, of course, typically would be, who cares? It's just what the gods will. That's the answer. Go back to plowing a field or something like that. And so the gods would punish you if you offended them for committing this sin of hubris. But if you, let's say I was Thales and I asked you guys this question and you engaged in the answer, well, if the gods saw you engaging in an answer, they would think that you're just as culpable for a sin against the gods as the person asking the question. And so even if Thales asked this question, most people wouldn't want to talk about it with him. And in fact, most people would be like, you know what? Because we don't want the gods to think that we're with you, we're going to punish you. And so there's a good chance that a normal person, which Thales was probably not, um, would have been killed for asking that question. You know what things are made of? It's God stuff. Now you have to die. And so, luckily for us, and luckily for them, they waited to hear Thales' answer. Now, there's different ways you can answer this question. This very first question, what is everything made of? You could say it's made of multiple things, or you could just say it's made of one thing. And if you say that everything's made of just one thing or one stuff, we would call you a monist. And that's exactly what Thales was. He was a monist, and he thought the answer to the question that everything was made of is water. And so the moment the people around him hear that everything is made of water, they're like, oh, we get it, you're crazy. And back then you weren't allowed to kill crazy. Killing would generally be an act considered going against the god of death, Santo. So they're just like, okay, we'll just leave you to your whatever, your questions, I guess. And so, well, they didn't kill him. They kind of ostracized him. And so he spent a lot of time just sitting around thinking and looking at certain things. But I want to focus on his answer of water because I think it's a pretty good first answer to the question of what is everything made of. So he's from a town called Miletus, which would be kind of modern day Turkey, coastal town along the Aegean Sea. And so, in a town like that, when you look out at the horizon, all you see is water. So, there's really just water everywhere. But it doesn't stop there. Again, they don't really have a lot of deep insight or thoughts about the nature of reality back then. And so, not only is there water all around you, there's this big blue thing above you. And every once in a while, water falls from there too. And so, it wouldn't be a stretch to think that that's all water up there. But it goes even deeper because anybody who's lived on or near the coast, if you dig a hole in the ground, it doesn't take long for water to start coming out. So there's water above you, water below you, water all around you. And then we can go within you. If you poke a hole in yourself, something comes out. Water. So again, water above, water below, water all around us, and water within us. And now we can start to see this in other things as well. You put an acorn or something like that in the ground, and you pour water onto that acorn, eventually it grows. And then once you take a tree and break the branch off and feel inside of where the branch was, it feels wet. And so for him, he was saying, yeah, every single thing that exists is made of this one stuff. Everything is made of water. Now, that didn't satisfy people back then. They were just like, no, that's a crazy thing. How could you say that everything is made of water when the stuff that you drink is wet, for example, and the rock that you're sitting on is not wet? They're clearly different stuff. Also, we shouldn't be talking to you, so goodbye. And so Thales really wanted to account for a major issue that faced the ancient people. He wanted to account for this notion of change. And so change was mysterious back then. Imagine being a little kid and a magician, I don't know, standing in front of you and has their magic stick and their magic hat or whatever, and they put a feather inside of their top hat and they say some magic words with their magic stick and they reach out and pull out a bunny. And as kids, we're just like, holy shit, you just turned a feather into a bunny. And that was it. That's all we needed. And when we ask, how did you do that? The answer is, it's magic. And then we don't dig any deeper because we believe in magic. Now imagine everybody believed in magic, they wouldn't dig any deeper. And that's the kind of story of the ancient world. Why are things changing? Well, it's just the gods doing their magic. Okay, cool. Let's go and do other things and not question it at all. Again, not Socrates. Thales wasn't wasn't really moved by that. And so he started to think about this more and more. And he's like, if everything is made of water, we can start to account for different types of change. And so he identifies two types of change. We have what is called qualitative change, or a change in quality. You go from one type of thing to a different type of thing. And we have quantitative change, which is clearly just a change in quantity, and that's going to be a change in size or amount or something like this. And so with water, we can account for qualitative changes, which is not easy to do. So let me give you a quick scenario of a person who hikes up to the top of a mountain. And it's cold and icy, and they maybe have some tools, and they break off a chunk of this mountain and they bring it back down to their town. And they lock this big chunk of mountain in their, I don't know, room or something like that. Nobody can come in, nobody can come out. And they just leave it in a big copper bowl. And they return a few days later. And we can understand that that thing that they were just climbing on, ice climbers, of course, can surely recognize this. That thing that they were just climbing on, that thing that they were standing on, that physical solid thing has now turned into a bowl of water. That thing that I was walking on a little while ago is now something that I can drink. Water has the ability to change from one type of thing to another type of thing without any magic. That's the behavior of water. Well, now if we take that bowl that's now filled with water, that was something we were climbing on, and put it over a fire, that same water starts to evaporate and becomes air, becomes gas. And so again, we can move from the thing that we're climbing on to something that we can inhale, because that's the way that water functions. And so for him, seeing all these different types of change in the world, that can be accounted for by just suggesting that everything is actually made of water. So what about quantitative change? How does water change size or amounts? Well, again, you can imagine just water in a big copper bowl, and depending where you live, it could be either very dry or very humid. If you live in a very dry area, if you have a bunch of water in a bowl and leave it alone for a while, it's going to start to evaporate. It's going to go from one amount of water to a less amount of water, all on its own. And so also in terms of a humid area, you could have a certain amount of water, and because the air is so humid, that water can actually acquire more droplets and looks like it's getting bigger or more. And so water again looks like it has the ability to account for change both qualitatively and quantitatively. And so I think all of that's really impressive. The fact that he looked around and came up with water and kind of saw water as this essence of life and all these other things, all that really pales in comparison to just how important that question was. First of all, the fact that he asked it without fear of being killed, but just the ability to ask such a different question. I don't think I have the words to put into context just how unique and important that actually is. So again, people weren't really moved by Thales' question. They weren't really moved by his answer. But slowly that idea would start to sink into people and start to change the world forever. Other people, maybe not directly, but indirectly at least, started asking interesting questions. And eventually we get to the classical age of philosophy. Again, the people like Aristotle and Socrates and Plato and people like that. So I want to talk about some of the things that happened to Thales based on, I wouldn't say that he was actually ostracized, but he definitely had more time than he maybe would have preferred. And so imagine you sit in the same place. And I know a lot of you spend a lot of time outdoors. Imagine you sit in the exact same spot every day, all day, for years and years and years and years and years. Naturists do this all the time. And of course, when we do this, we start to notice things. We start to notice patterns in the weather. We start to notice patterns in the sky. Ooh, we start to notice patterns in seasons and growth and all that. And so Thales inadvertently started to learn about the universe because he just didn't have a lot of other people to share his time with or talk to, and he started noticing things. So I want to talk about a couple contributions that Thales made, independent of raising this question, what is everything made of? And so there's this anecdote, and I might take a little poetic license with it, but it's about this machine called an olive press, which is a really important machine for people in the ancient world. I mean, it allowed them to press olives to make oils and things like that. And so there was a really bad winter, and Thales had this notion, look, if we ever have a really bad winter, the following spring should provide a large crop of olives. And so he waits for a particularly bad winter when people were desperate. He would go to them and he would knock on the door and he'd be like, hello. And they'd be like, oh, it's Thales. Don't answer it. And he's like, I can hear you. We live in the ancient world. These walls aren't very, very thick. And so they're like, oh, yeah, Thales, what's going on? How can we help you? And he's like, I would like to buy your olive press. Now, these people with very little money would be desperate for anything they can get, and they would be like, "Sure, I'll sell it to you." And so he buys an olive press, and people start ridiculing. Well, what are you going to do? Press snowballs, your precious little water? And he's like, "Yep, that's exactly. I'm going to just press some snowballs." And so he goes to the next, I don't know, group of people, and he's like, "Hey, I would like to buy your olive press." And so he buys another olive press and another. He buys all the olive presses that he can find. And if they didn't think he was crazy before, now they think he's absolutely batshit insane. And so he's basically got a wall of olive presses. People have no idea what he's doing, and he's just kind of betting on himself. And so, sure enough, winter ends and spring comes, and there is a huge crop of olives. And people are like, "Oh, this is awesome. We're going to make it through any winter. This is great." And so we get through summer, and eventually it comes harvest time. And they're like, "All right, let me go harvest these olives. What did I do with my olive press?" Of course, I sold it to Thales. Let me go buy it back. But now Thales literally owns all of the olive presses. Um, and he's able to sell them back at whatever amount that he wants to because he's got a kind of monopoly on them. And he was able to make quite a bit of money just by noticing things and looking at things in a different light. So that was one of the contributions that he made. I talk to students about this all the time, and that there's a lot of people that'll get a business degree, but a number of the top earners in the Fortune 500 have philosophy degrees. If you get trained in business, you're going to get trained like everybody else. But if you get trained in philosophy, you're going to learn to see the world very differently. And, it leads to new discoveries, just like we evidenced by Thales Olive Press. All right. So, in addition to that, he did lots of other things. Let me share a few with you. He suggested that the Earth was a flat disk. Not perfect, not exactly right, but at least he added some curvature to it. That's impressive. And then looking at the stars, he noticed there was a group of stars. Not that he was the first to notice this, but where he was from, he was. And there was a group of stars that was always in the north. Now, back then, if you were a sailor in Miletus, you would just hope that you'd go out and come back. That's a very dangerous job and not get lost. But more often than not, people would get lost, and a lot of people would die trying to be seafarers or sailors. But he pointed out, look, if you're ever lost at sea, just look for Ursa Minor. Now, Ursa Minor is a constellation that we call the Little Bear. And in the Little Bear, there's a arm, which is called the Little Dipper. And in the Little Dipper, there's a star that we call the North Star or Polaris. And so that discovery alone is responsible for saving thousands of lives between the time that he discovered it and the time that this conversation is being recorded. And so he's making money, he's making predictions about planets, he's saving lives. He got bored and tried to figure out the height of the pyramids, and he did that. He came within just I don't know, a very very short number between what they actually are and his predictions. And so while people had a very difficult time trying to figure out the height of the pyramids, he just measured the shadows, which seems obvious to us, but back then they were just like, how do we figure these things out? And so the pyramids were ancient, even to the ancients. And so he's like, wait for the time of day that your shadow is at a 1-to-1 ratio with your body. And at the time that your shadow is at a 1-to-1 ratio with your body, the pyramids will be at a 1-to-1 ratio with their shadow as well. And then you just have to measure the shadow and you're good to go. And so one more point I want to make about Thales is this battle between Lydia and Persia over the Halys River. So the Persian Empire was big, and you didn't really want to mess with them. And so the Halys River was controlled by Lydia. And so the Persians show up, and they're like, "Hey, this is our river now." And the Lydians are like, "No, it's not. We're gonna fight you," or something like that. And so the Persians were like, "Well, you're never going to cross this river. It was too wide to cross. The current was too strong. And if they tried to cross, the Persian army would just be there to stab them as they tried to get out of the riverbanks." And so there's like, we can't figure it out. They tried everything. It's very difficult to get an army all the way around a river to go to the other side. You're not going to be able to build a bridge. Of course, the Persians wouldn't allow you to get halfway across before they chopped it down. If you tried to sail across on boats, that would take a long time to build, but also the Persians would be right there to just like poke you as you're getting out and then steal all your boats. They didn't have any long range weaponry or anything like that yet. So they needed to get this army across, and they just couldn't figure out how to do it. So Some guy's just like, hey, I know this guy. He seems to know a lot about water. Maybe we can get him to come and help us out. And people are like, what? Thales? No way. Like, if he's here, we're definitely going to lose. The gods will look poorly upon us. Never. And so they still can't get across. And so maybe somebody higher up is like, oh, what about this guy Thales? And they're again like, oh, no, that's never going to happen. And they still can't do it. And another guy's like, what about Thales? And eventually they agree, yeah, let's get Thales over here. And Thales looks at this and he's like, look, you guys aren't really doing anything anyway. So grab a shovel, dig a hole. So they dig a big hole next to the river. And once that hole is dug, they connect the hole to the river. It's what we refer to as diverging the river today. If you don't like where a river is, just move it. And if you have enough people to dig a big enough hole, you can just relocate the river. And if the river now, which is cut in half of it going its normal trajectory and half of it into this hole, if it's still too big, just dig another hole and cut it in half again and again and again. And so now instead of having to cross some big, gigantic river, you can just cross a series of streams or brooks or something like that. And so the Persians did not lose many battles, but this is one that they did lose, all thanks to, well, from our perspective, thanks to Thales, but he probably didn't get any credit back then because all credit goes to the gods. Maybe Athena was on their side or something like that. So anyway, the next time you think of who the father of philosophy is, you might think it's Socrates or Plato or Aristotle, but we wouldn't have those guys if it wasn't for the actual father of philosophy, Thales of Miletus. I will say that he had a follower before I get out of here named Anaximander, who took his question and ran with it. And then it gets to Anaximenes and eventually Pythagoras. And now that initial question, what is everything made of, spread like wildfire. And here we are today. So thank you for listening. Thank you for Thales. We'll catch you on the next one.
If you enjoy listening to adventure stories, then you should visit theDIHEDRAL.com. You will find stories from other members of the community and read about climbing, life, and the outdoors. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Let's connect and climb on!
Climb on!